The city of New York in the winter was a mix of shimmering lights and dark shadows, where the bustling streets pulsed with life even under a gray, overcast sky. The snow that had fallen days earlier was now a dirty slush, splashed by passing cars and trudged over by the hurried feet of pedestrians. The air was crisp and sharp, biting at the skin, with a chill that crept deep into the bones. Street vendors wrapped in thick coats shouted to the passers-by, offering hot coffee and roasted chestnuts. A faint scent of cinnamon and smoke mingled with the ever-present aroma of exhaust and fresh-baked bread from the bakeries lining the sidewalks. Amidst the noise and rush, a tall figure moved deliberately, his silhouette cutting through the winter haze. He was clad in a tailored black coat that seemed out of place against the city's rough-and-tumble backdrop. His eyes, sharp and watchful, scanned the streets as he walked, but his mind seemed far from the reality around him. The sight of the bustling city should have filled him with a sense of achievement, but instead, a heavy weight pressed on his chest, as if the city itself were pressing down on him. Alex Rutherford was a man whose name was synonymous with power. A self-made billionaire, his empire spanned technology, real estate, and finance. Alex was not just a businessman, he was a visionary, the kind of man whose decisions could shift markets and whose image was plastered on billboards and news sites around the world. Yet today, as he walked down the uneven pavement, surrounded by the noise and chaos, the sharp, biting cold felt like an echo of the emptiness inside him. He was no stranger to the weight of expectation, but recently, the applause and accolades had begun to feel hollow. Public appearances and boardroom meetings were just part of an endless cycle, an unrelenting performance he no longer had the will to maintain. The world knew him as the man with a silver tongue, whose confidence and charm could turn any situation in his favor. But deep down, behind the charisma and the suits, Alex struggled to reconcile the man he appeared to be with the man he truly felt himself to be. As the wind picked up, carrying the scent of winter's icy breath, Alex pulled his coat tighter around him, seeking warmth against the bitter wind. He paused at a corner, watching the street vendors hustle and the city pulse like an ever-throbbing heart. The Christmas lights strung between buildings twinkled in colors of red, gold, and silver, casting a glow that only seemed to deepen the shadow in his eyes. It was that glimmer of artificial cheer that pushed him to keep walking, to escape the reality of his life, even if only for a short while. The thrum of car horns and the shuffle of hurried feet blended into the background as Alex found himself moving off the main path and into a quieter part of the city. The buildings here were older, worn down with peeling paint and cracked facades, a stark contrast to the luxury high-rises that defined his world. This was a part of the city he usually avoided, where homelessness and hardship seemed to sit like permanent residents. But today, he didn't care. The echo of the streets, the whispers of life that seemed so distant from his own, called to him in a way he couldn't explain. It was a summons he felt in the marrow of his bones. The world around him seemed to blur as he slowed his pace, caught in thought. It was there, at the edge of the city's fading light, that he noticed an old man sitting hunched over, wrapped in a threadbare coat, his face hidden beneath a battered cap. The man was cradling a cardboard sign that read, "Veteran. Please help." Alex's eyes met the man's for the briefest moment, and he caught a glimmer of something that he hadn't seen in a long time, dignity paired with despair. The sound of a child's laughter broke through the moment, pulling Alex back to reality. But as he looked around, his gaze returned to the man on the corner, whose eyes had now settled on him, weary but unwavering. For a second, Alex felt as if he were staring into his own reflection, lost, searching for something that no amount of wealth or status could provide. With a deep breath, Alex made a decision. The streets hummed around him, but in that heartbeat of silence, he knew that this was the beginning of something new. Something that would change both him and the life of the man who sat waiting in the cold. Alex Rutherford's steps slowed as he drew closer to the figure seated on the cracked pavement. The old man was a stark contrast to the polished streets that surrounded him. His coat was torn at the seams, stained with grime and the smudged remnants of past winters. A once bright patch of army green on the back of the coat had faded to a pale, sun-bleached shade, and the worn, frayed gloves he wore did little to shield his hands from the biting cold. His thin frame hunched forward as if the weight of years had become too much for him to bear, and his face, lined with deep creases, was obscured by the battered cap that sat low on his brow. He was holding a worn cardboard sign with trembling fingers, the ink nearly smudged beyond recognition. It read, "Veteran. Please help." There were patches of white hair peeking from beneath the cap, and though his eyes were hidden, Alex could sense their weary depth. They spoke of a man who had fought wars, lost friends, and come home to find that victory had no place in the life he now endured. The wind cut through the streets, lifting a small wisp of hair from the veteran's brow, revealing eyes that were blue, the color of winter's last breath. They were eyes that had witnessed too much but still held a flicker of hope, as fragile as it was. Alex stood there for a moment, his breath shallow as the weight of his own decisions pressed against him. He was used to having conversations with people who spoke in terms of numbers, strategies, or high society pleasantries. Yet here, in this quiet corner of the city, the air felt different, charged, raw, and vulnerable. For a heartbeat, Alex wondered what it would be like to be that man, to sit with a past filled with sacrifice and a future marked only by the uncertain day-to-day. The veteran's eyes finally lifted, catching Alex's gaze. The look was not one of pleading, it was one of recognition, as if the man saw Alex not for the wealth or fame but as another human, another soul. For a second, the noise of the city seemed to fade, the horns, the chatter, and the rush all drifting into the background. "Cold out here, isn't it?" Alex said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, soft, almost tentative. The veteran's mouth twitched, perhaps at the simple question, at the warmth of being seen, even for a fleeting moment. He nodded, shifting slightly, but his eyes didn't leave Alex's. "Been a long day?" Alex asked, noticing the tremor in the veteran's hands and how they seemed to cling to the sign for some sense of purpose. The man met Alex's gaze, and this time, there was a hint of a smile, one that came not from joy but from something deeper, a glimmer of acknowledgement. "Long years," he replied, his voice rough as gravel but tinged with resilience. "You learn to find warmth in the smallest things." A pang shot through Alex's chest. For years, he had surrounded himself with the warmth of luxury, the glow of fame, and the comfort of wealth, but it had never reached this part of him, the part that craved human connection, something real. Here was this man, sitting at the edge of a city that had all but forgotten him, who found warmth in the mere act of being seen. Alex's eyes fell to the veteran's sign, and then back to his weathered, kind face. The crowd swept around them, passing as if they were invisible, but Alex felt tethered to this moment, caught in the gravity of its truth. He didn't know why he had stopped, why the sight of this man had unsettled him, but he felt something within him stir, an unfamiliar yet welcome emotion. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was more than a figure in a suit, more than a billionaire in a city of millions. He was simply a man, standing next to another who needed something he never thought he could give. With a deep breath, Alex shifted and, for the first time, spoke not as a businessman, but as a man. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he said, the statement carrying the weight of unspoken promises, of possibilities, and of change. The veteran's eyes widened, the flicker of hope now a flame that danced in the winter air. Alex and the veteran, who introduced himself as Thomas Whitaker, settled into a small, tucked-away cafe that seemed to survive in the shadow of the city's bright lights and bustling streets. The cafe was cozy, its wood-paneled walls lined with faded photographs of long-forgotten memories, and the soft hum of conversation was a comfort against the chaos of the winter city outside. Thomas's eyes, now warmer but still weary, seemed to look inward as he took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth seep into his cold hands. He spoke in a deep, raspy voice that carried the weight of decades. "I was 18 when I first set foot in that dusty training camp. A kid with stars in his eyes, thinking he was invincible. The military taught me discipline, taught me how to be strong, but it also taught me things that never left me." Alex listened, his once cynical eyes softening as Thomas recounted the years of service, boot camp, deployment in conflict zones, the camaraderie forged in shared danger. Thomas described nights under foreign skies, the pounding of distant artillery, and the faces of comrades now long gone. There was a proud smile on his face when he spoke of the missions, of moments when victory seemed within reach. Yet, there was also an undercurrent of loss that deepened as he spoke of friends who did not make it home, whose laughter still echoed in his memories. The hardest part was coming back, Thomas continued, staring at the steam curling from his cup. You're given this medal, a symbol of service, and a pat on the back, and then they send you home like it's the end of a story. But it's not. That's when the real battle begins. Alex's fingers drummed absently on the table as he listened to the painful admission. It became clear that Thomas's struggles were not just those of an individual but of a broader issue, a societal failure to recognize and care for those who served. The echoes of war did not dissipate with the sound of a plane touching down on home soil, they lingered, cloaked in PTSD and the haunting silence of the unspoken. I'd wake up to the sound of gunfire, my heart racing, sweat soaking through my clothes, Thomas said, eyes distant, as though he could see the past playing before him. But it wasn't just the nightmares. It was the judgment when I couldn't hold a job, when I was passed over for opportunities. I tried, Alex. I really did. But the world I came back to wasn't the one I left. Alex felt the weight of those words press against him, a truth so raw it made the walls of the cafe seem suffocating. The statistics were all too familiar, thousands of veterans struggling with PTSD, depression, and homelessness, with little to no support. The system that was meant to honor them had instead become an obstacle to their recovery. I started off living in shelters, bouncing from place to place. There were nights when the cold seeped in, and I was convinced it would never let me go. I'd watch the city lights and wonder what it would take to be seen, really seen, not just as a name on a list or a statistic on a government form. Alex's throat tightened, realizing that Thomas's story was one shared by so many others. The city that celebrated victory after victory had grown deaf to the whispers of defeat that clung to its streets. And now, sitting across from the man who had sacrificed so much, Alex understood why the encounter had stirred him so deeply. It wasn't just a chance meeting, it was a reminder that he could do more, that the power of one moment could ripple through a life, making all the difference. Thomas's eyes met Alex's again, and there was no anger there, no bitterness, just the fatigue of survival. I'm not looking for charity, Alex. I just want to know that people care, that we're not forgotten. The words hung in the air like a question, a plea, a challenge. Alex looked at the man before him, realizing that their meeting was not a coincidence but a catalyst for something more profound, something that would echo long after their conversation ended. I promise you, Thomas, that you're not forgotten, Alex said, a resolve settling in his voice. And I'm going to make sure that more people understand your story. The days that followed were a blur of activity, but Alex found himself thinking about Thomas's words at the oddest times, while sitting in his high-rise office overlooking the city, during late-night drives with the hum of the tires against the road, or in the quiet of his apartment where the silence felt almost suffocating. The image of Thomas, worn yet resilient, haunted him, not as an obligation, but as a reminder of the stories hidden in plain sight, stories that deserve to be seen and heard. Alex's meetings, once consumed by the latest figures and profits, now seemed hollow. His focus shifted, eyes drifting from boardroom charts and spreadsheets to the memory of the man who had faced battle after battle, only to be left to fight the most grueling war of all, survival in a world that had moved on without him. The images of the veteran, his tough exterior belying the pain inside, spoke to Alex in a way that no business report ever could. He felt a pang of guilt at how he had never truly understood the struggle, the invisible weight carried by so many who served their country. As the weeks passed, empathy took root in Alex's heart, blooming into something he could no longer ignore. He started to see the faces in the crowd differently, the ones who sat at street corners with cardboard signs and hollow eyes. They were not failures, they were stories waiting to be told, people who once carried hope and dreams but were now caught in the relentless tide of life's trials. Alex would walk the streets, once a place he had hurried through, now a canvas of human experience. The city no longer looked like a realm of wealth and ambition, it was a patchwork of lives intersecting, some full of promise, others weathered and struggling. The distance between him and the people he once overlooked shrank. He had found his cause, and it was no longer just an idea, it was a calling that pulled at his soul. Fueled by the urgency of change, Alex set his plans into motion. He knew that solving the broader issue was beyond his reach alone, but he could start with something tangible. The first step was an outreach event, an idea born from sleepless nights and passionate conversations with those who shared his newfound vision. With the help of his network and a few trusted allies, Alex organized a community initiative, honoring Heroes Day, to provide support, share resources, and tell stories that had been overlooked. The day of the event was a mixture of nervous excitement and genuine anticipation. The community center, which had once been overlooked and underfunded, was transformed with banners and posters that featured stories of veterans, each one a testament to sacrifice and resilience. People from all walks of life attended, those who had never considered the struggles of veterans, and those who had lived it firsthand, seeking connection and understanding. Alex stood at the center of it all, shaking hands and offering kind words to anyone who came his way. His eyes caught Thomas as he walked into the room, an expression of disbelief softening the older man's weary face. He moved to greet him, clasping his hand in a firm shake. "You made this possible," Alex said, the weight of gratitude in his voice. Thomas's eyes glistened with emotion. "I never thought I'd see the day when someone would listen." Alex's heart swelled as he watched people share their stories, veterans speaking to crowds that hung on their every word, and volunteers offering everything from job training programs to medical services. The energy in the room was electric, sparking hope and building bridges between those who had felt unseen and those who had never looked past their own world. It was a first step, but it was powerful and promising. Later that evening, Alex took a moment to reflect. He looked out over the gathering, feeling that the warmth in the room was something far greater than a mere event, it was a movement. For the first time, he understood that empathy was not just a feeling but an action, a force that had the power to change lives, to heal, and to remind people that they were not forgotten. The old cynicism that once gripped him began to unravel, replaced by a newfound purpose. He knew this was just the beginning. As the laughter and conversations ebbed into the quiet of the night, Alex made a silent promise to himself: he would continue to act, to advocate, and to ensure that the world saw not just the success stories, but the real heroes, the ones who, despite everything, still fought for the chance to be seen. As the days turned into weeks, the connection between Alex and Thomas deepened, growing into an unexpected bond that neither had anticipated. It was a friendship forged not through shared experiences but through an unspoken understanding, an awareness that they both needed each other more than they initially realized. Driven by the bond he had formed with Thomas and the realization of how deep systemic issues ran, Alex knew that the time for action had come. It wasn't enough to simply listen and empathize, he needed to mobilize resources and inspire others to see beyond the statistics and stories of people like Thomas. It was clear that while many had been willing to donate time or money, few were invested in making real, lasting change. Alex took his idea to the community, starting with an open meeting at the local church hall, a place that had long served as a beacon for support and resilience in the area. He spoke passionately, sharing Thomas's story in his own transformation. He laid out a vision for a multifaceted initiative that would offer not just temporary relief but a pathway out of homelessness, shelters that could provide a safe haven, job programs designed to reintroduce veterans and other displaced individuals to the workforce, and mental health services to help tackle the deep scars left by trauma. With the support of a growing group of volunteers, Alex outlined strategic plans, building partnerships with local businesses, nonprofits, and even city officials who had never considered homelessness to be part of their agenda. It wasn't a quick process. There were endless meetings, fundraising challenges, and moments when Alex questioned whether it could ever come to fruition. But Thomas's unwavering trust and the stories of others who came forward kept him going. The first shelter, named Hearthstone Haven, opened its doors just 6 months after Alex's initial proposal. It wasn't a grand building, but it was warm, filled with the sound of laughter and the gentle murmur of hopeful conversations. Veterans who had been sleeping in the cold now had a safe place to rest, meals that weren't taken for granted, and the chance to speak with others who shared their struggles. Word of the project spread, fueled by media coverage and the powerful testimony of those whose lives had changed. Soon after, job training programs followed. Alex partnered with local businesses to create apprenticeships tailored to veteran skills, some with construction experience, others with management training. The first graduate of the program, a young veteran named Carlos, secured a job as a project manager at a construction firm. His story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that transformation was possible. The community's response was overwhelming. Volunteers flooded in, many inspired by Alex's commitment, others moved by Thomas's journey in the tangible progress they could see. People who had once walked past the homeless population with averted eyes now stopped, asked questions, and offered support. The city's mayor, initially skeptical, attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new shelter, acknowledging publicly that this was more than a local initiative, it was a movement. The term Hearthstone came to symbolize resilience, connection, and a community willing to change the status quo. It wasn't just the success of one project but the cascading impact that Alex had hoped for. Thomas, now a mentor within the shelter's program, stood beside Alex at the center's grand opening, pride in his eyes as he shook the hands of visitors and watched those who had once felt forgotten begin to find their way again. The movement that started from one chance encounter had become a story of hope, proving that when empathy and action merge, real, lasting change is possible. One afternoon, after a particularly busy day at the community center, Alex invited Thomas to join him for a late lunch at a small cafe not far from the city center. The cafe had an old-world charm, with vintage photographs and the rich scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. Thomas, whose world had been reduced to survival on the streets, found himself smiling as he sat across from Alex, who seemed more at ease than ever. Over coffee and sandwiches, they shared stories, Alex recounting tales of his childhood, of the mischief he'd gotten up to in his small hometown, while Thomas spoke about his early days in the military, the bonds he formed with his fellow soldiers, and the bittersweet memories of home. As they talked, Alex realized how much he had changed. It wasn't just that he'd gained insight into the struggles of others, it was that he had found a friend in Thomas, someone whose resilience and humility reminded him of what truly mattered. And for Thomas, seeing someone like Alex, who could have lived his life untouched by the harshness of reality, willing to listen and stand by him, was a gift that felt both foreign and familiar. One evening, as winter's chill swept through the city, Alex and Thomas stood together on the steps of the community center, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the snow-dusted pavement. They watched as volunteers finished up their shifts, laughing and saying their goodbyes. Thomas shifted his weight, the old wound in his leg reminding him of his past, but he ignored it, turning to Alex with a look of quiet gratitude. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Thomas asked, his voice low but filled with hope. Alex smiled, a genuine, warm smile that spoke of something real. "No. But I'm glad we did." It was more than just words, it was the acknowledgement that their meeting had changed both of them. Alex's life, once dominated by numbers and fleeting successes, was now rich with the kind of stories that couldn't be quantified. And Thomas, who had felt invisible for so long, was now seen, not just as a man with a past, but as someone with a future. A week later, Alex surprised Thomas with a visit to a small art gallery in the heart of the city, a place where local artists showcased their work. It was a place Thomas never would have stepped into alone, but now, under the encouragement of his friend, he found himself intrigued. They moved from painting to painting, discussing the emotions behind each piece, and Alex noted the spark in Thomas's eyes, the way he whispered, "That's exactly how it felt when I was there." In that moment, surrounded by art and words unsaid, the bond between them felt unbreakable. The simple acts, sharing lunch, standing together on cold steps, exploring the unfamiliar, were the small threads that wove their stories into one shared narrative. And though they came from different worlds, they had found something rare, a friendship born out of empathy, a reminder that the strongest ties are formed not by perfection, but by understanding and the willingness to stand by each other, no matter how rough the path. Driven by the bond he had formed with Thomas and the realization of how deep systemic issues ran, Alex knew that the time for action had come. It wasn't enough to simply listen and empathize, he needed to mobilize resources and inspire others to see beyond the statistics and stories of people like Thomas. It was clear that while many had been willing to donate time or money, few were invested in making real, lasting change. Alex took his idea to the community, starting with an open meeting at the local church hall, a place that had long served as a beacon for support and resilience in the area. He spoke passionately, sharing Thomas's story in his own transformation. He laid out a vision for a multifaceted initiative that would offer not just temporary relief but a pathway out of homelessness, shelters that could provide a safe haven, job programs designed to reintroduce veterans and other displaced individuals to the workforce, and mental health services to help tackle the deep scars left by trauma. With the support of a growing group of volunteers, Alex outlined strategic plans, building partnerships with local businesses, nonprofits, and even city officials who had never considered homelessness to be part of their agenda. It wasn't a quick process. There were endless meetings, fundraising challenges, and moments when Alex questioned whether it could ever come to fruition. But Thomas's unwavering trust and the stories of others who came forward kept him going. The first shelter, named Hearthstone Haven, opened its doors just 6 months after Alex's initial proposal. It wasn't a grand building, but it was warm, filled with the sound of laughter and the gentle murmur of hopeful conversations. Veterans who had been sleeping in the cold now had a safe place to rest, meals that weren't taken for granted, and the chance to speak with others who shared their struggles. Word of the project spread, fueled by media coverage and the powerful testimony of those whose lives had changed. Soon after, job training programs followed. Alex partnered with local businesses to create apprenticeships tailored to veteran skills, some with construction experience, others with management training. The first graduate of the program, a young veteran named Carlos, secured a job as a project manager at a construction firm. His story became a symbol of hope, a reminder that transformation was possible. The community's response was overwhelming. Volunteers flooded in, many inspired by Alex's commitment, others moved by Thomas's journey in the tangible progress they could see. People who had once walked past the homeless population with averted eyes now stopped, asked questions, and offered support. The city's mayor, initially skeptical, attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new shelter, acknowledging publicly that this was more than a local initiative, it was a movement. The term Hearthstone came to symbolize resilience, connection, and a community willing to change the status quo. It wasn't just the success of one project but the cascading impact that Alex had hoped for. Thomas, now a mentor within the shelter's program, stood beside Alex at the center's grand opening, pride in his eyes as he shook the hands of visitors and watched those who had once felt forgotten begin to find their way again. The movement that started from one chance encounter had become a story of hope, proving that when empathy and action merge, real, lasting change is possible. As winter melted into spring, the transformation that had begun with a chance meeting between Alex and Thomas rippled through the community and beyond. Thomas, once a figure of desolation, stood at the center of it all as a beacon of redemption and resilience. His journey was far from easy, filled with setbacks and moments when old habits and memories clawed at him. But the community, now invested in his story, rallied behind him, encouraging his progress with each new step. Alex's path, too, had reached a tipping point. No longer was he simply a billionaire with a philanthropic streak, he had become a compassionate leader whose initiatives were praised for their tangible impact. He had managed to bridge the gap between wealth and empathy, demonstrating that one could wield influence for good. In doing so, Alex had shifted from being a figure of skepticism to one of respect, embodying the change he had hoped to see in the world. The echoes of that original cold winter night, when he first encountered Thomas, felt like a distant memory compared to the life they now led. The shelter, now a fully operational facility named Hearthstone Haven, celebrated its one-year anniversary. On that day, Alex and Thomas, standing side by side, watched as the first graduates of the job program were celebrated. Families who had once been on the brink of despair now spoke of newfound hope, recounting stories of stability, reunions, and second chances. Thomas himself was now not only employed but mentoring new residents, sharing his story in small, vulnerable moments that resonated with many. Alex's initiative had earned him recognition, not just in his city but across the state. He was invited to speak at conferences, where he shared insights on compassionate leadership and practical strategies for addressing homelessness. He spoke about the power of partnerships and the importance of listening, not just as a billionaire with resources but as a human being who had learned to see people beyond their circumstances. One evening, a local newspaper published an article titled, "The Man Who Changed the Face of Compassion, an ode to Alex's perseverance and the tangible results of his mission." It showcased a photo of Alex and Thomas, arms draped around each other, both smiling with unguarded joy. That image, along with the accompanying stories of hope and recovery, spread like wildfire, inspiring similar projects in neighboring cities and earning Alex the admiration of peers and critics alike. Thomas, who had come full circle, also celebrated a pivotal moment in his own journey. He received an award for his volunteer work at Hearthstone Haven. It was a moment that symbolized not only his own redemption but the strength of a community that believed in second chances. When he stood on stage, accepting the award, his voice trembled as he spoke, not of the battles he had faced alone, but of the support that had brought him back to life. He glanced at Alex, who watched with pride, understanding that this was the moment where two stories had truly merged into one. Alex knew that he had not just rebuilt a man but had sparked a movement that now seemed unstoppable. The fight for lasting change was far from over, but as he stood there, surrounded by those whose lives had been transformed, he felt that in the most profound sense, he had found his purpose. And it was in that moment, as the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow across Hearthstone Haven, that Alex and Thomas knew their journey was just beginning. As the city basked in the warmth of a late summer evening, Hearthstone Haven hummed with life. Thomas, once lost and struggling, now stood tall, his eyes no longer shadowed with doubt but illuminated by hope. He was not just surviving, he was thriving. He had built relationships, taken pride in work he loved, and given back by mentoring newcomers who reminded him of his former self. Each new face brought a story of its own, and Thomas shared his with them, proof that even the darkest nights could give way to dawn. Alex, too, found himself changed in ways he could never have anticipated. His life was no longer a series of corporate meetings and luxury soirees, it was a mosaic of shared moments, triumphs, and challenges. His heart had grown fuller, and his purpose clearer. Every smile, every tear of joy, every thank you from someone whose life was better because of his work was a testament to his journey. He knew that the real measure of success was not in balance sheets or stock prices, but in the tangible differences made in people's lives. The story of Thomas became more than just an individual tale, it evolved into a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that transformation is possible when compassion leads the way. News articles, community speeches, and even art pieces honored his journey, depicting the quiet power of second chances. Hearthstone Haven was now known across the region as a beacon of change, a living embodiment of the idea that when one person chooses to act, ripples of good can spread far and wide. On one quiet evening, Alex visited Thomas at the shelter. They sat together on a bench as the city lights twinkled in the distance. Without words, they shared a look that spoke volumes, a moment that encapsulated gratitude, friendship, and the deep realization that what they had started was bigger than either of them. In the hearts of all who had been touched by their story, a belief had been rekindled, that hope could grow even from the harshest conditions, and that in the embrace of community, redemption and new beginnings were always within reach.